I think the most important thing that everyone is overlooking with this, for Shogo, that he leads off with at the beginning of the video is... Konnichiwa, Samurai James here. This is a video response to Shogo's video that's been going around about not buying a katana from an overseas website. Alright, so let's take a look at something here that we call a katana. This is a Japanese sword. It is curved, it has a black saya, and...
Actually, katana is not a katana if it did not come from the Katana region of Japan.
Alright, pardon that interruption. So, continuing to talk about this, what were Shogo's three main points about what a katana is? Well, it's a Japanese sword that can cut. By definition, this is a Japanese-style sword that can cut. This katana in this instance is a cold steel katana, but in a lot of cases it doesn't matter. I'm going to exclude obviously questionable things like stainless steel wall hangers. They are what we generally refer to as an SLO or a sword-like object. They're not meant to be cut with, they're not safe, they don't have a proper tang or anything else. So, is this a sword that can cut? Yes. Checks that first box. Now what was Shogo's second point? Well, a katana must be beautiful. And let's face it, beauty is often in the eye of the beholder. You know, that's a common saying, but this is something that I actually happen to find is a fairly beautiful sword. You know, there's nothing ornate or ostentatious about it. It's white Samigawa, it's black Ito, you know, it's a regular curved blade, it's a mono steel, so there's no hamon pattern to it. Do I prefer a hamon and clay tempering? Yes, it is a prettier sword. Is folded steel also prettier when you have some jigane or, you know, the pattern here that you can look at? Not just the hamon, but the pattern in the steel itself? Yes, that also makes it beautiful. But, you know, you can't just say because the blade is simple mono steel that it is not a beautiful blade. It's got a nice, well-defined bohea on it. It cuts really well, and, you know, a lot of times there's a saying, there is beauty in simplicity. And, you know, look at older Japan. They sat on the floor, you know. They were kneeling on mats and everything. They didn't even have chairs. England, you know, over in Europe and everything like that, they had fancy thrones and stuff. Now, granted, I'm sitting in a regular dining chair here because you do what you got to do. But the thing is, you know, this is a chair, and you can have a fancy chair. Just because a chair was a fancy, ornate throne didn't mean that there's not beauty in the elegance and simplicity of Japan, where they simply had their little mats to kneel on, their cushions and everything, and sat around the table. So if you were to say Japan is ugly because they don't have big thrones that their royalty would sit on, then, well, you know. Now what was Shogo's third point? Well, a sword must be deified, meaning it should be something that is meant as an offering to the gods or has a spirit associated with it. Now, is that true of some katana? Yes. And in his example, he says, look at all the beautiful katana that we have that have survived for so long. This is proof that they are treated as ceremonial or highly respected objects. And yes, that is true. There are things like my sword right here. The fittings on this, I've since learned, and I'll make a correctional video, are only a couple hundred years old, but the blade inside of here is actually 500 years old. And it's still in good condition because they took care of some of those things. But let's draw another parallel too. Let's look at some of the armor that we see for European people in surviving museums and in Japan. It is gorgeous, well-kept armor because it has survived that long. The stuff that was made for the rank and file, the Ashigaru armor, the lower grade man-at-arms armor, and simple foot soldiers for Europe, most of that doesn't survive because it was used, abused, and it was simply disposed of when it could no longer serve its purpose. So that's sort of a narrow vision of looking at what we have remaining as what the overall concept was. Let's extrapolate a little bit more on that. A katana that is made using Tamahagani steel and everything else, is that still a katana? Well, that really depends, because let's say it was made out of Tamahagani, but let's say it's just simply Tamahagani. Let's say they didn't do all their ceremonial stuff with it. That was done as they were smelting stuff in the Tatara to get the steel that they would pick through to get what would become the Tamahagani. Is that still a katana because it has all of the material composites to it? And maybe the smith that forged it out of the Tamahagani blank or, you know, bar itself, maybe he was religious and put something into it, but if other people didn't, does that mean that only the blade is and that the fittings and the saya isn't? So we're starting to draw a little bit of a weird line here, at least from my Western perspective. Now, I understand that in Japan there's a lot of tradition and everything else associated with it, and I respect that greatly. I'm simply speaking from a Western perspective. I'm not saying this to denigrate anything that Shogo has said. Shogo's awesome. I've been watching his videos since he had like under 100,000 followers, and, seen when other people joined him and they've departed and everything, seen as he's had his baby. So, 100% respect to Shogo. He brings an interesting perspective as someone who not only lives in Japan, but also has lived in the U.S. because he was here in the U.S. for a while too. He's got a cool perspective on that, which is part of why I enjoy watching him versus somebody that simply grew up and lived in Japan and is kind of been just in that culture. So he's got a little bit of a mix to it. But anyway, I digress on that. I want to make another point, and I'm going to go grab another sword to show you that. Okay, let's take a look at this sword. This is an Albion Talhofer. Albion is well known as one of the top tier companies in the United States that produces very, very good, high quality medieval replica swords. Now, why am I showing you this Albion sword? Well, Albion makes their swords with 5160 steel. However, European swords were generally mono-tempered, so that is still correct that this is a single homogeneous steel. But it wasn't made from an iron bloom. It wasn't created and forged into the blade, just like a historical European sword would have been. They use CNC to cut out the sword blank itself, and then they are hand finished. So they're using modern tools as well, including machines, not just, a human that has, maybe an angle grinder or something that they're using to grind down, or an electric sander. They're using a straight up CNC machine to cut out the blanks on this. Yet, they have gone to museums, they have handled museum pieces. Many of their swords, I'm not sure if this one is one of them, I believe it is, have actually had castings done of the original museum pieces. And although these are hand finished, they come out within a very good tolerance of what the original medieval replica was. It may be a half inch shorter or a half inch longer, which again is due to the hand finishing, and that's perfectly viable. Swords were not produced to the exact, millimeter or centimeter or quarter or fraction of an inch historically either. They weren't, mass produced. They were mass produced, but they weren't produced exactly the same, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So there was some variation. But a lot of people would simply say, this is a great replica medieval European sword. They wouldn't say, it's just a sword-like object because it's not made out of the proper iron and it wasn't made purely by hand. Are there people that do that? There are a very small handful, and what would that do to the price? Well, the price would go through the roof. This sword, with all of the machining and modern process to it, still costs $1,000 without even having a scabbard with it. I had to have the scabbard done separately. So look at the price point on that. This particular cold steel, I believe, was about $400 when I bought it 15 years ago, and I think it's still about the same. But the point is, there are katana, and there are katana. And that's just the way that the different tiers of swords within a particular sword go. There are extremely nice handmade medieval European swords, better than even this $1,000 Albion. There are $200 windlass that are perfectly functional cutters and will function close to how a medieval European sword did. But it's the same with the katana. Here's a $400 katana, and nowadays, we've got other options too. You can get a good cutting sword for $100 or less as a katana. Now, as you go up in price, things get better with it. Are there $1,000 katanas? Sure. Are there $2,000, $3,000, $5,000? Sure. You've got Motohara, you've got Citadel, you've got some of the others, and they make even fancier swords. Now, the Albion, again, that's made with the 5160 blade. The cold steel, I believe, is a 1075. But the weight is approximate, the shaping is pretty close, everything is fairly good as a fairly close correlation to what it would feel like physically to pick up a real katana and cut with it. And that's where some of this comes into play. A $300 katana is far more achievable for people than a $3,000 katana. And the thing is, when you're first starting out and you're doing things like katana cutting with tatami or any slightly harder materials, when you hit and you screw up that cut, if you cut and you put too much pressure when the blade binds on something, you can bend that blade if it's a traditional clay-tempered blade. The monosteel swords are actually more resistant to having damage or taking a permanent set or bend or damage from cutting, and they're cheaper. So that means more people are able to get katana to learn how to cut with them and not be at complete financial disaster risk by buying a $3,000 sword and damaging it as they're trying to learn the art. Now, that also assumes that you're learning to actively cut with it, but given that one of Shogo's criteria was that the sword can cut, I'm going to simply discount out things like Iato that are simply training swords as well. Meaning you're not in it just for the forms and the philosophical and mental aspects of everything. You're in it to actually learn how to cut with a real sword, which is why blade composition comes into play here. This looks like a katana blade. It cuts like a katana blade. It has katana-styled fittings. Everything else with it is pretty close. So if you're looking to feel more or less what it's like to be able to cut with a katana, this is perfectly fine. If you're looking for something to have on the wall that's functional, that will cut, this is perfectly fine, again, in my opinion, as a katana. If you're looking for something that was built as a ceremonial object that has specific spiritual attachment to it and everything else, then maybe it's not this. Maybe you have to look at a bunch of different katanas or have one made for you to feel that particular attachment to it. Anybody who collects swords most likely has a favorite, so you could almost say that feeling of which one is your favorite. Even if you don't know why, that feeling that that's the special one for you, maybe that's your spiritual sword. But, you know, in the West, there was no real concept of spiritual sword. A sword was simply a tool that you fought with, and it generally wasn't even your primary tool. I think the most important thing that everyone is overlooking with this, for Shogo, that he leads off with at the beginning of the video is he lives in Japan. There are rules in Japan. You can't import generic swords like this without it being a proper Japanese thing that is crafted as a katana. And I don't know what the exact criteria is, but clearly the ones from China don't cut it. So if Shogo wanted to buy something from one of the cheap katana people, in Longquan and have it imported and use that to use for cutting, he simply can't. So, there's no reason to really go into a big debate on would I or wouldn't I, if you simply can't, and it's illegal. I can pick up a katana from China, I can pick up a katana from Japan, I can pick up, obviously, an Albion sword that's a European replica, because I'm in the USA and so are they. But the thing is, I have no less respect for this sword as a medieval replica being made with modern tools, some modern processes, and hand finishing to get an item that as an end result is very close to a historical item that it is based on. I don't say this sword didn't come from Europe and was not made from bloomery iron, therefore it's garbage. I understand it's a modern blade, but that doesn't impact my ability to learn how to cut with it, to look at it, to appreciate it, and everything else. And truth be told, if you look at this, you cannot tell from looking at it if this is 1060, if it's 1095, if it's T10, if it's 5160, 9260. You simply can't tell. You have to do a metallurgical test to be able to figure that out. Whether that's, having some of the metal actually tested, chemically or however they do that, or looking under some kind of like fine-grained microscope. But just looking at a sword like this, you cannot tell the difference. Here's a 5160, and here is a 1070. Again, I believe it's a 1070. It may have been a 1095 at the time. It may have also been 1080. There are varying grades, 1060, 1095. That's the ones we usually hear about, but 1070 exists, 1084 exists. Anyway, look at these two blades. They are almost the same. They are monotempered. They have a single appearance to them. There's no grain or anything else, but visually, you can't really tell the difference on it. So if this was a 1060 sword, it would still cut. It'll lose some edge to it, and it'll just need resharpening. 1060 is still a functional cutting steel. It's not good if you're going to be using it long term for thousands and thousands of cuts. There's more durable swords, but that's a subject for another video. And to wrap this one up, again, think of what a katana is and also where Shogo is coming from. Shogo declared up front, here are my 3 criteria for what I call a katana. And here's why the ones in China that are produced as they are do not qualify. They're struck down on point 3 and arguably sometimes on point 2 for the beauty aspect or not. So based on that, even if you wanted to buy something from overseas, they generally wouldn't qualify. Even Motohara uses high-grade steels, but they're not using Tamahagani. So even a $3,000 Motohara, in Shogo's terms, would not count as a katana. But to most of us, a Motohara is an awesome katana, and we would love to have one. I certainly would like to have one day, but I don't yet. And the thing is, that's okay. Everybody has their different goals and what they're doing with their collecting, with their training, and everything else. So again, appreciate everything that Shogo's coming from. So just two different perspectives. One from somebody in Japan that has a very traditional outlook on what a katana is, also based on how he's using it for some things. Whereas, my opinion here in the West, as someone who appreciates samurai arms and armor and everything else, because clearly, hey, look at my channel, but also understanding that at the end of the day, a sword is a tool, and I look at it from that perspective. A sword is a tool. If I can get something that is very close, then that's what I'm going to do. If you found this informative, entertaining, or otherwise useful, give me a like if you haven't, subscribe if you haven't, join the Samurai Squad. It's always appreciated. This is Samurai James saying thanks for watching, and sayonara.